The year was 2287, and humanity had spread itself thin across the stars, like a fire that refused to go out. It was not a clean or pretty expansion. It was messy and loud and full of mistakes, but it was real, and it was growing, and nothing had been able to stop it yet. The Voketh Dominion had been watching for a long time. They were old, older than any human civilization had ever dreamed of being, and they ruled 8 full star systems with a kind of calm authority that came from never having been seriously challenged. They had fleets that could darken a sky, and armies that could break a world, and for decades they had looked at humanity the way a mountain looks at a river, with complete indifference. But the river had kept moving. It had pushed into territories the Dominion considered its own buffer zones. Not with warships, but with miners and farmers and engineers and stubborn colonial families who built homes in places nobody thought were worth building in. The Dominion sent warnings. Humanity acknowledged the warnings and kept building. The Dominion sent armed patrols. Humanity sent diplomats who talked for so long that the patrol commanders eventually went home out of sheer exhaustion. And that was when the High Council of the Voketh Dominion sat down and had a very serious conversation about what kind of species they were actually dealing with. The conclusion was not comfortable. A full war against humanity would be winnable. That was not in question. But the cost estimates kept coming back higher than anyone liked. And the strategic models all agreed on one thing. Humans did not stop when they were losing. They adapted. And an adapted human was a far more dangerous thing than a comfortable one. Chancellor Drevos, who was the true power behind the aging emperor, stood before the High Council and laid out a different option. He called it containment through integration. Everyone else called it a political marriage. The idea was simple enough. Bind humanity to the Dominion through ceremony and law. Give them enough recognition to quiet their expansion, and then slowly fold them into the Empire's structure, where they could be managed from the inside. It was not peace. It was a collar designed to look like a crown. The Emperor's third daughter, Princess Saraval, was chosen to be the Dominion's side of the arrangement. She was not chosen by accident. She was the sharpest political mind in the imperial family, and Drevos needed someone who could manage a human consort without making the whole arrangement look like what it actually was. Saraval agreed without argument, which surprised everyone, but she had her own reasons, and she kept them close. On humanity's side, the United Earth Council spent 3 weeks in closed sessions arguing about the proposal. Some called it a surrender, dressed in silk. Others called it the most important survival decision in human history. In the end, the pragmatists won. They needed a representative, someone who would be the human face of this arrangement, and the choice needed to be someone the Voketh could not easily manipulate or intimidate. They went through dozens of names: generals, politicians, diplomats, scientists. Every single candidate had been profiled extensively by the Voketh negotiating team during the preliminary talks, and the Dominion's behavioral analysts had flagged each one with notes about pressure points, ambitions that could be leveraged, fears that could be used, egos that could be stroked. Then someone at the back of the room mentioned Commander Ethan Voss. He was not famous. That was the first thing anyone said about him. He was a mid-ranked military officer who had spent the last 12 years working in frontier security and border mediation, the kind of work that got no recognition, medals, and very little attention. But the behavioral analysts had nothing on him. They had watched hours of footage from the preliminary negotiations, where he had sat in the room as part of the Earth security team, silent, still, watching, and they had come back with a report that said simply, "This individual produces no readable stress responses under social pressure." Someone at the council table said that sounded like a good description of a very boring man. Someone else said it sounded like a good description of a very dangerous one. Ethan was brought in and briefed. He listened to everything without interrupting. The terms of the treaty, the expectations of his role, the political stakes, the risk to his own future. And when the briefing was over, he sat quietly for a moment and then asked one question. He asked whether there was a genuine chance this arrangement could actually prevent a war. The council member across from him said yes, if it was handled correctly. Ethan said he would do it. No conditions, no requests for rank or compensation or guarantees, just a simple agreement, delivered in the same tone a person might use to accept a shift change at work. The council member later told a colleague that the conversation had been the most unsettling thing she had experienced in 30 years of politics, and she could not fully explain why. The treaty was signed in a formal ceremony that was broadcast across both civilizations. Saraval watched Ethan's feed from her private quarters on the Dominion capital ship. She studied his face during the signing, looking for the thing that most humans showed in high-pressure moments: the performance, the visible effort to appear calm. There was none. He signed the document, looked up at the camera for exactly 1 second, and then looked away, as if the camera had ceased to be interesting. Her aide asked her what she thought of him. She said she did not know yet, and that this was the most interesting answer she had found to any question in a long time. Ethan departed Earth on a diplomatic transport 3 days after the signing. The send-off was attended by a modest crowd, some council officials, a few military colleagues, a small gathering of ordinary citizens who had come more out of curiosity than ceremony. As his shuttle lifted through the atmosphere and the curve of the Earth appeared in his viewport, he looked at it once, the blue and white of it, the familiar shape of continents he had crossed a dozen times, and then he turned forward in his seat and did not look back again. He was not suppressing emotion. Those who knew him well would have recognized the look on his face as something much simpler. He had made a decision. And when Ethan Voss made a decision, the decision was made. The shuttle docked with the Dominion escort vessel 2 hours later. Voketh Honor Guard on the dock was enormous and heavily armed, more than protocol required, and they stood in absolute stillness as he walked off the ramp with one bag over his shoulder and no security detail. One of the guards noted in his log that the human did not slow his pace upon seeing them, did not look around the ship in the way newcomers always did, and did not ask any questions. He simply stopped at the correct position, waited, and looked forward. The guard wrote in his log that he was not sure what he had expected a human to look like, but he was fairly sure this was not it. The Voketh capital world of Vethkara was the kind of place that was designed to make visitors feel small. It was not accidental. The architecture was intentional. Every tower built to a height that dwarfed the species standing beneath it. Every corridor wide enough to make a single figure look like a mistake in an otherwise perfect composition. The planet's sky was a deep violet during the day, and the oceans glowed at night with soft blue light from the organisms living just beneath the surface. It was genuinely beautiful and also genuinely overwhelming, and most foreign dignitaries arrived with their composure already damaged before they had taken 20 steps. Ethan arrived and looked around the landing platform the way a carpenter looks at a house he has been asked to repair, with calm, professional attention, making quiet notes, finding nothing that required alarm. The formal introduction to the imperial court was scheduled for the 2nd. Saraval spent the night before it reviewing protocol with her aide. The rite of lowering was not optional. It had never been skipped, not once in 400 years of recorded Dominion history, and the act of performing it before the Emperor was not merely ceremony, it was the physical confirmation of a relationship. The foreign party acknowledged the Emperor's authority, the Emperor acknowledged the foreign party's existence, and the hierarchy was established clearly for everyone in the room to witness. Her aide asked if she thought the human would perform it correctly. Saraval said she thought the human would do exactly what he decided to do, and that was the part she could not predict. She was right. The court gathered in the grand chamber. Several hundred nobles, military officers, and foreign dignitaries arranged in the tiered viewing galleries that lined the walls. And the emperor sat at the far end, on the high seat, still and ancient, and surrounded by the symbols of 4 centuries of unbroken power. Ethan walked the length of the chamber alone. He wore simple, clean clothes, not the elaborate diplomatic costume that had been sent to his quarters the night before, just a dark uniform without decoration, neat and precise. He walked at a steady pace, not fast, not slow, and every person in the chamber watched him, because there was something about the way he moved that made watching unavoidable. There was no performance in it, no awareness of the audience, just a man walking toward a destination. He stopped at the correct distance from the emperor, and then he bowed. It was not the rite of lowering. It was nothing close to the rite of lowering. It was a single clean forward nod of the head, the kind a soldier gives to a commanding officer, respectful and precise and containing absolutely no submission. The chamber erupted, not in noise at first, in a kind of collective, held breath that lasted about 2 seconds, and then the noise came, overlapping voices from every gallery, the sharp clicking sound that Voketh made when they were agitated, the rustle of formal robes as people turned to their neighbors in disbelief. Chancellor Drevos was on his feet before the sound had finished building. He raised his hand and his voice at the same time, and called for the human to be removed. The word he used, translated roughly as, escorted out like a problem that had been allowed to walk in on its own. Saraval raised her own hand. The chamber went quiet, because her hand meant something. She was the emperor's daughter and the named party of the treaty, and her authority in this specific matter was not a small thing. She said clearly enough for the entire room to hear that the human would remain. Then she looked at Ethan and said that he would join her in the consultation chamber. He followed her without any visible concern about what had just happened. The consultation chamber was smaller and quieter, and the door closed behind them with the sound of something heavy and final. Saraval stood across from him and studied his face for a long moment. She asked him if he understood what he had just done. He said he did. She asked him why he had done it. He thought about the question with genuine attention, not stalling, actually thinking. And then he said something that she later wrote down in her private notes, because she did not want to forget the exact shape of it. He said that he respected her father, and that respect was a real thing he intended to carry through the entire duration of this arrangement. But that belonging to someone was a different thing, and he did not belong to the emperor, and pretending otherwise would be a lie, and a lie at the foundation of a peace treaty was a worse problem than an awkward moment in a ceremony. He said that if she needed him to do something specific to make this work, she should tell him and he would do it. But he would not perform being less than he was, because that helped no one. Saraval was quiet for a long time. Then she asked him a question that surprised even herself. She asked him how long it had taken him to learn the Voketh social hierarchy well enough to know exactly how much he could push without breaking anything irreparable. He said about 4 days, from the briefing materials he had been given on the transport. She asked if he had any idea how long it took most foreign diplomats to reach that level of understanding. He said he did not know the exact number. She said it was typically between 8 and 14 months, and that some never got there at all. He nodded once, as if this was useful information, and waited. She told him that 3 members of a noble faction had filed a formal complaint against him before he had even left the chamber, and that they would likely escalate to something more direct in the coming days. He thanked her for telling him. She said she was not done yet. She said that if something direct happened, she expected him to handle it in a way that did not create a diplomatic incident. He said he would do his best. 4 nights later, 3 figures came through the outer wall of his guest quarters, using a disruption tool that bypassed the standard locks. They were professional, fast, quiet, well-equipped, and they clearly expected to find a sleeping and unprepared target. They found Ethan standing in the center of the room, in the dark, fully dressed, as if he had been waiting. What followed lasted less than 90 seconds. All 3 were on the floor when it was over, alive, unharmed beyond bruised pride and some temporary discomfort. And Ethan had zip-tied their wrists with a length of cord he had apparently prepared ahead of time. His bed. He walked them to the palace guard station himself, presented them calmly, gave a clear and factual account of what had happened, and asked if there was a report form he needed to fill out. He mentioned the incident to Saraval the next morning, casually, near the end of a briefing on the day's schedule. She stared at him. He asked if the schedule included a midday meal, because he had not been told, and he wanted to plan his time correctly. She told her aide later that she was beginning to understand why the Voketh behavioral analysts had come back with nothing on this man. There was simply nothing to find. He was exactly what he appeared to be, all the way down, and that was the most disarming thing she had ever encountered in a lifetime of navigating people who showed only surfaces. The state tour was Chancellor Drevos's idea, and like most of his ideas, it had more than one purpose running underneath it. On the surface, it was a diplomatic gesture, a chance for the human consort to see the breadth and depth of the Voketh dominion, to understand the scale of the civilization that had offered humanity the shelter of its treaty, and to carry that understanding back to Earth's Council as a reminder of what refusing the arrangement would have cost. Underneath that, it was a lesson in smallness. Drevos wanted Ethan to stand inside a Dominion military installation and feel the weight of it, to look at the fleet numbers and the ground forces and the industrial output, and understand in the bones of him how far out of his depth he actually was. It was the kind of move Drevos had used on many foreign representatives over the years, and it almost always worked. Saraval knew this, and she watched Ethan during every stop of the tour. Focus of someone trying to solve a puzzle before the answer was given away. He did not react the way Drevos wanted him to react. At the first military installation, a deep space dock facility the size of a small moon, Ethan looked at the rows of warships with calm interest, asked 3 technical questions that the facility commander had not expected from a civilian, and then spent 20 minutes talking to the maintenance crews working on the lower decks rather than the officers who had been arranged to impress him. On the second world, a dense industrial planet covered in processing facilities that ran around the clock, he asked to see the worker housing before he asked to see the factories. The tour coordinator was confused by this request. Ethan said that the condition of worker housing told him more about how a civilization actually ran than any factory floor, and he would like to see both, if possible. The coordinator looked at Saraval, who nodded. They saw the housing. It was not good. Saraval had known this in an abstract way. She had read reports, seen numbers, but standing in the actual corridors of the residential blocks for the Thurak labor workers, with their low ceilings and poor ventilation and the quiet exhaustion on the faces of the people moving through them, made the numbers feel different. She noticed that Ethan said nothing about it. He just looked and remembered. The 4th stop was the place where everything changed. It was a low-gravity mining planet called Veth Dun, and it was in the middle of a labor dispute that had been building for 3 months. The Thurak workers, the same client species she had seen in the housing blocks, had stopped working the main extraction shafts, and were gathered in a large open area near the facility's main entrance. Several thousand of them, quiet but immovable, their shift leaders standing at the front, with expressions that had gone past anger into something heavier and more serious. The Voketh corporate administrators had already requested a security response, The security forces were waiting 2 levels above, ready to move on authorization. Saraval stood in the observation room, looking down at the crowd, and ran through the standard options in her head. Disperse, detain the leaders, resume operations under guard. And she knew how it would go, and she knew it would work in the short term, and she knew it would make everything harder in ways that would not show up in reports for another 2 years. Ethan was standing beside her. He asked how long the authorization for the security response would take to process. She said, about 40 minutes. He asked if she would give him 40 minutes first. She looked at him. He was not asking for permission to do something dramatic. His face held no excitement, no plan to be a hero. There might be a better solution, and wanted to try it before the worst one was used. She said yes. He took off his diplomatic identification badge, left it on the console, and went downstairs alone. She watched from the viewport as he crossed the open floor between the facility entrance and the crowd. He was completely exposed. No armor, no weapon, no communication device in his hand. And the crowd watched him come with the wariness of people who had learned to be suspicious of anyone walking toward them with authority. He stopped about 10 steps from the front line of shift leaders, and then he sat down on the ground. Just sat, cross-legged, relaxed, as if he had chosen this particular spot for a rest. The shift leaders looked at each other. He looked up at them and said, in basic Voketh trade language that was rough but understandable, that he was not from the company, and not from security, and he was not there to tell them to go back to work. He said he was there because he wanted to understand what had happened. One of the shift leaders, a large Thurak with 4 arms and deep-set orange eyes, told him nothing had happened, that this was the result of 3 months of things happening, and that a single conversation was not going to fix any of it. Ethan said he agreed completely. He said he was not there to fix anything today, he did not have the authority to fix anything today, but that he had the time to listen. And listening was not nothing, and he would rather sit here for an hour and actually hear what they had to say, than walk away having understood nothing. The shift leader stared at him for a long time. Then he sat down too, and after a moment, so did the others around him. Saraval watched from above, as the standing crowd of thousands, slowly, gradually, in sections, found places to sit, and the atmosphere in the room shifted from the tight-wound pressure of something about to break into something slower and more human, or more Thurak rather. But she was beginning to understand that the difference might be smaller than she had been taught. 2 hours and 17 minutes later, Ethan came back upstairs. He had a handwritten list, actual handwriting on actual paper, which he had apparently been carrying in his jacket, of 9 specific grievances the workers had identified as the most urgent, along with 3 proposed process changes that the shift leaders themselves had suggested and believed they could get their people to accept as a starting point. The security response authorization was cancelled. That night, in the transport moving to the next destination, Saraval sat across from him and asked him how he had done it. He said humans had been sitting down in front of angry crowds for thousands of years. It was not a new idea. They had just learned over a very long and often painful history that most people who were angry because something real had gone wrong, and that listening to that thing was not weakness. It was the fastest route to actually solving anything. She asked if he had been afraid walking into that crowd. He thought about it, genuinely, carefully, the way she had learned he thought about everything, and then said yes, he had been afraid, but that being afraid had never stopped humans from doing things. It had only ever changed how carefully they did them. She sat with that answer for a while. Then she asked him something she had not planned to ask. She asked if he had ever been somewhere fully at peace, where nothing was broken or pressed or held together with effort. He thought about that one for even longer. He said he was not sure, that most places he had known were somewhere between crisis and recovery, but that he thought peace was probably not a destination so much as a direction, and you could feel when you were moving toward it, even if you never arrived. She looked out the viewport at the stars moving past. She said that was a strange and sad way to see things. He said it had not felt sad when he believed it. It had felt like enough. She did not answer, but she did not look away from the stars for a long time after that. And something in the way she sat had changed, just slightly, in a way that her aide noticed later, but could not find the right word to describe. The Grand Imperial Summit happened once every 10 years, and nothing in the known galaxy compared to it. Every member species of the Voketh Dominion sent representatives, the great and the small, the powerful and the merely surviving, and they gathered on the Dominion's oldest ceremonial station, a structure that had been built before humanity had invented writing. And they sat in the tiered galleries of the Grand Forum and watched the Dominion remind everyone, including itself, of what it was. It was political theater at a scale most humans would have found difficult to process. Ethan found it interesting. He spent the first 2 days of the summit observing, watching who sat near whom, who spoke to whom before the official sessions began, who avoided eye contact with whom across the gallery. And by the end of the second day, he had a clearer picture of the Dominion's internal politics than most of the foreign ministers who had been attending these summits for decades. Chancellor Drevos had been planning his move for weeks. The trial of worth was an ancient tradition. It had existed for longer than any living member of the court could personally remember, and its original purpose had been to assess whether a foreign bloodline entering the imperial family was fit to carry that association. It had not been invoked in over a century. Drevos invoked it on the morning of the third day. He stood before the full assembly and laid out the argument with the smooth confidence of a man who had rehearsed it many times, that the treaty between the Dominion and humanity was built on an assumption of mutual standing, and that the human consort standing within the imperial family had never been properly established, and that without the trial of worth, the marriage itself existed on unstable ceremonial ground that could, if challenged in the High Court, unravel the entire treaty. He was careful to frame it not as an attack on Ethan, but as a procedural concern about the integrity of the peace. Saraval sat very still through the entire speech. She knew what Drevos was doing. He was building a legal path to dissolve the treaty that he could claim was her doing rather than his own. And she knew that objecting directly would only give him the confrontation he wanted. She looked at Ethan. He was watching Drevos with the same expression he wore when he was reading a document, calm and thorough and filing information away. When Drevos finished, Ethan said that he accepted the trial. The chamber went very quiet. Drevos looked momentarily uncertain. He had prepared for resistance or appeals or procedural objections, and a man who simply said yes and sat back was not the variable he had planned for. The trial of worth had 3 stages, and each one was announced before it began, so that the assembled delegates understood what they were witnessing. Stage was called the endurance test. A Voketh warrior, trained in nerve stress induction, stood before Ethan and placed a device against the back of his neck that sent controlled waves of pain through the nervous system. Not damage, just signal, pure and relentless, and the test was simply this: how long could the subject remain still and silent under that signal? The gallery was told that Voketh warriors in peak condition lasted an average of 4 minutes. The standing record, held by a military champion, was 9 minutes and 12 seconds. Ethan sat in the chair, and the test began. At 4 minutes, the gallery had gone quiet. At 7 minutes, several delegates had leaned forward in their seats. At 12 minutes, someone in the upper gallery made a low sound that was not quite a word. Ethan sat with his hands resting on his knees, and his back straight, and his eyes level and open, looking at nothing in particular, and the only thing that changed about him as the minutes passed was that his breathing became very slow and very deliberate. Not controlled in the way someone uses control to fight something, but in the way a person breathes when they have decided to simply be somewhere for a while. At 18 minutes, the presiding official stopped the test. The Voketh warrior who had administered it stepped back and stood very still for a moment before returning to his station, and there was something in his posture that had not been there before. Ethan rolled his neck once and waited for what came next. The second stage was the mind test, a strategic war simulation run against Grand Admiral Vethros, who had not lost a simulation in 11 years, and whose tactical record was considered among the finest in active Dominion service. The simulation was projected above the floor of the forum, so that every delegate could watch in real time. A three-dimensional battlefield with units represented by glowing markers, the logic of war made visible. The admiral opened with a standard formation that was considered near unbeatable against conventional opposition. Ethan did not play conventional opposition. He scattered his forces, apparently randomly, in a way that made no tactical sense to any trained military mind watching from the gallery. There were confused murmurs. Then the admiral's formation, optimized for a conventional response, began losing pieces, not to direct attacks, but to a dozen small pressures from unexpected angles, each one minor on its own, each one forcing a small adjustment, the small adjustments accumulating into a shape that had no good answer. At 11 minutes, the simulation reached a state that the adjudicating system could only classify as a draw, a condition that had no precedent in the trial's recorded history. The admiral stared at the board for a long time. Then he looked at Ethan. He said, in a voice that carried clearly through the quiet chamber, that he would like to run it again sometime under non-ceremonial conditions. Ethan said he would look forward to that. The third stage was combat. The Voketh champion was everything that word implied, tall enough to make the arena feel scaled for smaller creatures, with the layered muscle structure of a species bred across centuries for exactly this kind of contest. And the rules were simple. Unarmed, no armor, no time limit, the bout ending when one party could not or would not continue. The gallery expected it to be brief. It was not brief. The champion was faster and stronger and had reach advantages that should have ended the contest in the first exchange. And technically speaking, the champion landed far more strikes than Ethan did. The problem was that Ethan kept moving. Not gracefully, there was nothing elegant about it, but relentlessly, with the kind of stubborn, continuous motion that refused to acknowledge the logic of the situation, absorbing impact and redirecting and coming back from angles that should not have had any angles left in them. There was no point at which Ethan looked like he was winning. There was also no point at which he stopped. 8 minutes in, the gallery was silent again. 14 minutes in, someone began making the low, rhythmic sound that Voketh used as an involuntary response to witnessing something they could not categorize. At 23 minutes, the champion landed a strike that sent Ethan back 3 full steps and should, by any reasonable accounting, have finished things. Ethan stopped moving backward. He straightened. He looked at the champion with the same level, open expression he used for everything. Not defiance, not rage, just presence, the complete and quiet announcement that he was still there. The champion stood across from him for a long moment. Had not happened in the trial's recorded history. He inclined his head, a slow, deliberate forward movement, the warrior's acknowledgement, given not to a victor, but to something the champion had decided required acknowledging. The chamber was absolutely silent. Saraval stood up. She did not applaud. That was not the right gesture for what this was. She simply stood, and her voice carried into the silence with perfect clarity. She said that the delegates now understood why humanity had been invited into the Dominion as partners rather than absorbed as a client species. That the thing they had witnessed was not a performance, it was a fact about what humans were, and that the Dominion was fortunate to have made peace with that fact before making the other choice. The motion Dravos had prepared to dissolve the treaty was never called to a vote. Several of the noble faction members who had backed him spent the rest of the summit carefully not making eye contact with anyone. After the session closed, Ethan found a quiet corridor near the delegate quarters and stood there with his back against the wall. He was bleeding from a cut above his eye, and moving carefully in the way of someone doing a private inventory of what hurt. Saraval found him there. She asked if he was all right. He looked at her, and then looked at the ceiling for a moment, and then said she should ask him again tomorrow, and that tonight he would mostly like to stand somewhere quiet for a few minutes. She stood there with him. The corridor was empty, and the station hummed around them with the quiet noise of systems running, and neither of them said anything else for a long time, and that was exactly the right amount. In the months that followed the summit, the political landscape of the Dominion shifted in the slow and irreversible way that large things shift, not with a sudden break, but with a gradual leaning, like a great structure finding a new center of gravity. Chancellor Dravos still held his position. Removing him would have created more instability than managing him. But the coalition he had built around the idea of dissolving the human treaty had lost its belief in itself. And a political faction without belief is just a collection of people in the same room, waiting for an excuse to leave. The delegates who had watched the summit returned to their home worlds, and they talked. They talked about the endurance test, and the war simulation, and the combat, but mostly they talked about the smaller things. The way Ethan had answered questions after the trial, with the same ordinary directness he used to ask about meal schedules. The way he had not celebrated any of it. Way he had stood in that corridor, bleeding, and simply asked for a few quiet minutes as if he were any person after a hard day. Other client species began requesting meetings. They came carefully at first, a representative here, a quiet inquiry there, and they came not with formal petitions, but with questions. The kind of questions people ask when they have been watching someone for a long time, and have finally decided that the watching is not enough. They asked Ethan what humans had done when their workers had no way to raise grievances. They asked what humans had done when their client populations had felt invisible to the central authority above them. They asked him, and this was the question that came up most often, in different languages and from different species, but always carrying the same weight, how humans had gotten from where they were to where they were now, given that where they had been was by most accounts not a good place at all. Ethan answered every question, honestly, and without making humanity sound better than it was. He told them that humans had built grievance systems and torn them down, and built different ones, and that most of the progress had come from people who were angry enough to demand change, and stubborn enough to keep demanding it after the first 20 times they were told no. He told them that it had been painful and slow and full of backsliding, and that there were still parts of it that were not finished, and might not be finished in his lifetime. He told them that this was not a discouraging thing, that the direction mattered more than the destination, and that moving towards something better was its own kind of answer. Saraval heard reports of these conversations, and read transcripts of some of them, and she added them to the private record she had been keeping since the first week of Ethan's arrival on Vethkara, a record that had started as a strategic assessment and had become something harder to name. She was implementing changes. The grievance framework Ethan had outlined on the mining world of Veth Dun had been formalized and was now active across 3 sectors of the Dominion, not as a major policy shift, but as a quiet administrative adjustment, the kind that Dravos could not oppose without making himself look like he was against people being able to register complaints. 2 other sectors had sent requests to join the framework. She had approved them without ceremony. Dravos moved in the way she had expected him to move eventually. He found a journalist from a respected Dominion media outlet and gave her a detailed account of Ethan's selection process, including the behavioral profiling and the psychological suitability assessments that Earth's Council had run before choosing him. The story was framed as an exposé. Humanity had engineered the perfect diplomatic weapon and inserted it into the heart of the Dominion under the cover of a peace treaty, and the whole thing was a calculated manipulation of Voketh good faith. The story spread quickly. Saraval watched to see how Ethan would handle it. He handled it by sitting down for an interview with the same journalist 3 days after the story ran. He told her that yes, Earth's Council had profiled him extensively before choosing him, and that yes, they had selected him partly because he was psychologically resilient and hard to read under pressure. He said that this was not manipulation. It was exactly what any civilization should do when choosing a representative for its most important diplomatic arrangement, that you looked for the best version of yourself, and you sent that forward. He said that humans had always done this. They had always taken whatever was strongest in them and put it at the front when things were hard, not to deceive, but because hope required representation. Put your best face toward the thing you were hoping for. He said that if any part of what the Dominion had seen from him in the past months had been useful or interesting or worth remembering, then it was worth remembering that it came from somewhere, that there was a whole planet of people behind him who had produced this in all their messiness and argument and refusal to give up, and that he was not exceptional so much as he was a fair sample of what that planet could do when it tried. The journalist asked him if he thought humanity deserved the treaty they had been given. He said he thought humanity deserved what it built, and that building was what they were doing, and he hoped the Dominion would find them worth building with. The story that ran afterward was not the story Drevos had planned. 3 weeks after the interview, Saraval found Ethan on the high balcony outside the eastern wing of the palace, a long open terrace that faced the ocean. The bioluminescent water made the night look like it was breathing. She had been looking for him for a specific reason. There was a document she needed his review on, a preliminary draft of the joint charter that human and Dominion legal teams had been building together for 2 months. But when she stepped onto the balcony and saw him standing at the railing looking out at the water, she did not mention the document. She stood beside him. The ocean moved below them, and the light from it shifted in slow pulses, and the sky above was full of stars that belonged to systems she could name, and some that had no names yet. After a while she asked him what he was actually hoping for, not for Earth, not for the treaty, not for the political outcomes that both their sides were carefully tracking, but for himself, in whatever time he had. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said he had always wanted to see something fully at peace, a place that was not being held together or fought for, or waiting for the next crisis. Just a place that had gotten there and was simply existing in it. He said he had never seen that. She said that was the most human thing she had heard from him, and she had heard many human things from him by now. He turned and looked at her, and there was something in his face that was not quite a smile, but was related to one. The expression of a person who has been understood correctly after a long time of being only approximately understood. He said that he thought this place might be worth staying in long enough to find out if it could get there. She looked back at the ocean. She said she thought it might be worth trying. Below them, on a lower floor of the palace, translators and lawyers and political advisors from 2 civilizations were bent over a long table, covered in documents, arguing in 4 languages about the exact wording of a charter. Had never existed before, and might change everything. On a planet far away, people were going about their lives in the full, complicated noise of being human, afraid and arguing and building things and tearing things down and building them again. Stubborn past any reasonable explanation, refusing to stop. Ethan had come from that place, and he carried it with him in the way people carry the thing that made them, not as a burden but as a fact, present in every room he entered, visible to anyone who looked closely enough. He had not come to the Dominion to win anything. He had come to prove that winning was not the only option. On the balcony, in the slow light of a glowing sea, that proof was still standing.